Okay, good evening, everybody. Let's begin this evening's talk. My name's David Amigoni, Pro Vice Chancellor for Research. Just, of course, to note that the sun is out for once, and while you're sitting in here awaiting a lecture, I just happened to notice that people are doing headstands out on the lawn. So try not to be too distracted by what's going on on the lawn. We're really delighted to welcome Professor James Wilsden to the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Keele for tonight's Grand Challenges lecture. Now, as you'll know, I'm sure, the Institute is at the heart of Keele's long-standing commitment to interdisciplinarity, encouraging academics and students from diverse fields to nurture those new ideas that cross disciplinary boundaries. And anyone who follows the current research landscape, which Professor Wilsden's lecture tonight addresses, will know that it's a landscape that is deeply committed to the idea and principle of interdisciplinarity and the crossing of disciplinary boundaries. In fact, that very idea of the grand challenges, from which we take the title of this series, depends on that very idea of boundary crossing and acknowledging that there are some societal and cultural challenges that are just so of such scale that only a range of disciplines collaborating together can successfully address them. Well, tonight, James Wilsden is going to give us a guide to what that landscape looks like in his title, After Brexit, UKRI, if you want to, a field guide to the new research landscape. Because if our research landscape is designed to address the grand challenges, it's another grand challenge as a higher education institution to kind of exist and survive within it. And it's going to be that kind of challenge that James is going to speak about tonight. Professor Wilsden will draw on his experience at the heart of UK research policy to consider the opportunities and challenges presented by changing research system and the ever-increasing need for robust social science, novel methodologies, and interdisciplinary analysis of complex problems. And there are a few better people positioned to provide such a guide, because James has established a long history of working in policy and making his research interests include the role of evidence and expertise in policy making, the politics and practice of scientific advice, interdisciplinarity, and particularly between the natural and the social sciences. Science and innovation policy in the UK, EU and China, and public engagement at the research are at the heart of his work. Now, currently, James Wilsden is Professor of Research Policy in the Department of Politics at the University of Sheffield, and in addition, Director of Impact and Engagement for the Faculty of Social Sciences, and Associate Director in the Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures. So a really strongly positioned speaker for our Grand Challenges series. From 2013 to 17, James chaired the UK's Campaign for Social Science, and this is where many of us will have really encountered his work. Chaired an independent review of metrics in the management of the UK research system following the last REF, and many of us who have a role in research management will have read and really welcomed his 2015 publication, The Metric Tide. Now, building on this, he recently chaired an expert panel on the next generation metrics for the European Commission. From 2014 to 17, James was director of Nexus Network, an ESRC initiative to link research policy and food across a policy across food, energy, water and environment. And in 2015, James was elected a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and he now chairs its policy working group. Now, previous roles have included Professor of Science and Democracy at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex between 2011 and 2015, Director of Science Policy at the Royal Society between 2008 and 2011, and Head of Science and Innovation at the think tank Demos between 2001 and 2008. He was Senior Research Fellow at Lancaster University's Institute for Advanced Studies, Senior Policy Advisor at Forum for the Future, and Special Advisor to the UK Sustainable Development Commission between 2000 and 2001. And he also practices public engagement. He is an engaged intellectual by writing for Wonky and other media outlets, and he contributes, as many of you will know, regularly to the Guardian's political science blog. It is a great pleasure to welcome James to give his talk, just to remind you of the title, After Brexit, UKRI, if you want to, a field guide to the new research landscape.
David, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here, and a real pleasure to be joining a fantastic lineup of speakers that you've had through this series. I was pleased to see former colleagues and friends like Anne Power and Andy Sterling among the list. So it's great to have this opportunity. I suppose when you think about grand challenges, whether it's the future of housing, as Anne will have talked about, or the end of work, or the environmental crisis, which George Monbiot is going to address with you. These kind of questions about the organisation of the research landscape are rather a small beer. I mean, they're sort of rather inside the beltway kind of issues compared to those massive existential challenges out there. But as we all know, in the university system, if we get this stuff wrong, it fundamentally impedes our ability as researchers, as universities, to tackle those big questions. And if we get it right, potentially our ability to contribute is massively enhanced. So I want to talk, as David said, about some of the changes that we're seeing in the research system at a time of fairly profound shifts in the institutional landscape. We're now just over 2 weeks, I guess, into the brave new era of UK research and innovation, formally launched on 1st of April. And this, as I'm sure you all know, is the big new mega funding structure that's been set up, one of the products of the Higher Education and Research Bill last year. It brings together all of the different research funding bodies, the research councils, and Innovate UK, and the research side of HEFGE in the new form of Research England under this one umbrella. And the promise, the sort of rhetoric that lies behind its creation is, as David said, the potential for far more strategic coordination across the research system, the potential to support interdisciplinarity in new, more effective ways, and to do so with vastly increased resource. The budget of UKRI on the day it started was £6.2 billion a year. That will go up very quickly by 2020 to £8 billion a year. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the other things that might be happening to the budget, both good and bad. So the promise here is for a step change in the management and delivery of research and innovation through the UK. And I want to really explore why it's been set up, what lies behind some of that rhetoric, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the opportunities. So I'm going to just whiz through in about half an hour a quick reminder of why we've ended up here. There's a bit of a debate about how we pronounce the name of this thing. I'm one of the people who leans towards calling it UKRI, in part because it allows me to make all sorts of cheesy puns in talks and articles. I think that the official government position is UKRI, but making UKRI, why have we ended up here? 9 brains or mega brain, how is this thing going to work, this new structure? What are some of the complications that are created by Brexit? Which of course is a requisite line item in any talk these days. And then finally 5 priorities for UKRI as a structure as it sort of gets into full speed, and 5 opportunities for us within the university system. So to start with the background, and apologies to those who lived through this what seems very recently as we had lots of debate about the Higher Education Research Bill. that bill, that act, which came into force just before the last general election, was commonly described as the most significant piece of higher education legislation for 25 years. On the research side of that act, which actually got less political attention ultimately than the other bits, you have to look back a lot further. You really have to go back 50 years to the period between the Science Act of the Harold Wilson government in 1965, you see up there on that slide, and then two influential reviews that followed 5 or 6 years later, one by Rothschild, the other by Frederick Dainton, which between them looked at the two sides, Dainton looking at the research council system as it then was, and basic research funding, if you like, and Rothschild looking at the role of government-funded research, particularly through government departments. And it was a product, really, of those three documents that led us to the research system that we have grown to know, love or hate, depending where you stand, over the past few decades. So the different research councils, obviously joined then more recently by Innovate UK and some of the other changes through HEFGE. It's a big change. The structures really have been reorganised. There was a lot of debate about the pros and cons of doing it in this way. Behind the decision to include the research bits in the Higher Education and Research Act, there was a sort of back history to this, which is worth just touching on. The origins of it really come from this document, Our Plan for Growth, which was published just at the end of the coalition government, so in 2014, when Greg Clark briefly was Science and Universities Minister. That was, not much discussed as a document at the time because it was very close to the then 2015 general election. But one of the significant things about that document is it was written by Mark Wolpert. And in it was included, to some surprise, a decision to launch a review of the Research Council structure under the chairmanship of Paul Nurse, who was then President of the Royal Society. So this thing was put in, no one was really expecting it, and that led us down the path towards the Nurse review there, ensuring a successful UK research endeavour, and all the other changes then that follow through the Green Paper, White Paper and the Bill. When Paul Nurse published his review, his original proposal was to call this new body Research UK or RUK, RUK, and it was only some way into the planning that some bright official in 1 Victoria Street spotted that RUK was the word in Dutch for jerk off. And so even as they contemplated Brexit, they were reluctant to allow UK research excellence to become synonymous with wank, and UKRI was born. It wasn't entirely clear why it was needed. We knew when the Conservative Manifesto was published for the 2015 election that they intended to bring in the TEF and the kind of changes that we're living through now on the teaching side of the system. The research side of the system in many respects was and is very high performing. There wasn't an obvious problem to which UKRI was the solution. The only real insight that was offered by the minister at the time, Joe Johnson, after the election was a sense that the system had become too complicated. There were too many moving parts. It needed to be made simpler. And I'm told on a reliable source that in his very first week in the job, some bright spark, again, another bright spark in the department, decided to put in his red box this diagram as a sort of explainer of how the research innovation system operates. And so I think from that moment on, it was sort of seared on Joe Johnson's consciousness that this system had become far too complicated. A good reminder to be careful what you show to your boss. That agenda, a sort of bureaucratic managerial agenda of simplification, collided then with a more ideological drive to pare back the number of public bodies that were funded through what was then BIS, now BEIS. Sajid Javid, as Secretary of State, was very keen to burnish his Thatcherite cost-cutting credentials, and he brought in McKinsey over the summer of 2015 to produce this document, BIS 2020, which set out plans to reduced the number of bodies that BIS was responsible for by half as part of a much broader cost-cutting move. And of course, within the BIS family of 47 or so public bodies, the research councils, 7 of those, plus Innovate, plus HEFGI, accounted for a fair chunk. So there was an additional rationale at play here to deliver cuts in headcount, to deliver further efficiencies through bringing all of these bodies together. And these, dynamics and the sort of prospect of merging the research councils in particular caused, as you might expect, some uncertainty and consternation across the research community. A lot of people were unhappy at the idea. They didn't see why it was needed. They thought there were risks, and they argued that it would be unnecessarily disruptive, particularly then when the referendum happened soon after, and you had all of the added uncertainties of Brexit. So there was quite a period of argument about this. I say not as vocal as the argument we had around TEF and the regulatory structure, but still a significant pushback. Various amendments were offered to reassure the scientific community in particular that UKRI would not actually make that much difference, that the governance structures as we know them would be largely protected. And at that point, the science community and most of the universities basically said, well, okay, go ahead. And of course, it then went into legislation. The next significant development was the appointment, up he pops again, of Mark Walpert, the man who'd originally called for the review that led to the creation of this thing, then re-emerges as its first chief exec, coming off the back of his period as government chief scientific advisor. And I suppose the cynical amongst us had spotted early on that the intended launch date of UKRI did coincide with the end of Mark's tenure as GCSA. So that was a sort of neat segue. And I mean, of course, he's a very well qualified person to be doing that job, having not only been government chief scientist but also run the Wellcome Trust. But again, the appointment of someone like that has left some lingering uncertainties and concerns in certain quarters about the potential for greater control of the system, the loss of autonomy and independence for the different research councils, etc., which we can talk more about. Who is UKRI? Who are UKRI? These are a few of the key players. Mark Walpert, of course, there in the centre. Sir John Kingman, up there on the top left, the chairman of the UKRI board, former permanent secretary at the Treasury, or second permanent secretary. Rebecca Endine, very influential player, director of strategy for UKRI, was until she took that role on inside BIS, was sort of managing the research council aspect of the system from within government and has moved across to be director of strategy. And then below that, David Sweeney, known to you, I'm sure, from his long-standing role at HEFGI, architect of the REF. He has moved across to be chief exec, or executive chair, I should say, of Research England, the new body that will run the REF. And there on the left, the latest appointment, this was just announced yesterday, in fact, Ian Campbell, who's become the new executive chair on an acting basis of Innovate UK. Innovate UK is one of the big winners of all of the changes in this system. I mean, it's gone from being a relatively modestly resourced and recent addition to the system, with a budget not much in excess of 220 million pounds, to a much more significant player in large as a result of the industrial strategy, which I'll say more about. So those are a few of the people who are running this new operation. It's got a growing team. They're still currently operating out of the government department that gave birth to UKRI, out of BIS, but they will later in the summer move into their own headquarters in London. And of course, the bulk of people working now in UKRI are still back in Swindon in the research councils as they were before. So one of the big questions about this new structure, and this came through very strongly in the debate about the bill, you had this sort of tension between, on the one hand, the rhetoric, the promise of, as I said at the start, of greater strategic coordination, of much more effective dynamic interdisciplinarity, of more challenge-relevant, policy-relevant, business-relevant research, through this new structure, which implies a new and more intelligent and effective degree of coordination of that system. On the other hand, a sort of reassurance that was being put out to the community that, well, actually, not that much will change. Don't worry, it's all going to be fine. And this is still not entirely resolved, and it can be sort of summed up in a way as the sort of nine brains or mega brain argument. Sir John Kingman, when UKRI was being created, talked about it as nine brains in one body, because he wanted to convey the idea that the different elements, the different research councils, ESRC, EPSRC, etc., would still be sort of thinking autonomous beings, albeit in this one big corporate body. Set against that is the question of the extent to which the strategic centre of UKRI will grow and how the relationship between the different layers, the different parts within the system will operate in practice. I mean, all of this is quite arcane stuff in a way, but of course it has real direct purchase on how research funding is dished out, who decides what is a priority, who decides what is a challenge, how much money is then attached to those different priorities, and how is it spent. And if we look at the budget side for a moment, and this is a very striking feature of that has accompanied the creation of UKRI, we've gone in a very short period of time from the continuation of what we had through the entirety of the last Parliament, basically flat budgets, that diagram there from the Times Higher a couple of years ago. We then had the addition of the Global Challenges Research Fund, which predated UKRI, and that was that green line started to come up there on that graph on the left. 1.5 billion, as we know, through GCRF. To then an additional 4.7 billion through the system, attached to the Industrial Strategy Fund, and this was announced in the autumn budget of 2016. And this is really serious money. I mean, Treasury was correct. It wasn't just spinning when it announced this and said it was the largest single uplift in research innovation funding since before the Thatcher era. A very, very significant additional spend through the system. And of course, we're now getting to understand more about how that money will be spent, the kind of mix of modes of spending. We've had wave one of the industrial strategy, which basically landed large amounts of money in a few sort of pet projects, pet initiatives that were sort of pre-cooked inside government. We're now into wave two, and there are all these other themes that I won't list that have been announced, and we're expecting a whole flurry of additional calls from the research system, basically the moment we get through the local election purdah, to start against some of these other wave two challenges. And then before you know it, we'll be into wave three, where there'll be further themes again. It's a lot of money to spend through the system in a very short period of time. It's ought to be spent by financial year 21-22. So this is a big significant change. Of course, we don't quite know how it's all going to end up being allocated, and particularly the balance between spending through more conventional research council type modes and spending through business-led initiatives of various kinds. But it's significant. And then on top of not only the 1.5 billion for GCRF and the 4.7 billion for Industrial Strategy Fund, we've now also got this bigger aspirational target from the government, which was in the manifesto, well, in different ways was in the manifesto of all three main parties at the last election, but certainly the Conservative manifesto, to raise the overall research and development intensity of the UK economy from the 1.7% of GDP, where it's hovered, bobbing a little bit up and down for many years, to a much more respectable, in terms of benchmarking against other EU research leaders and certainly the big emerging economies, a much more respectable 2.4% of GDP. Now, that would be a really significant uplift. Although, of course, as is always the case with GDP-related targets, it's less of a stretch if the size of the economy shrinks, which segues us into Brexit. But if we just look at what the 2.4% target would be, I've lifted this graph from my colleague at Sheffield, Richard Jones, who thinks and writes a lot about industrial strategy and productivity. And without going too much into the detail there because of time, if you assume a modest growth scenario for the UK economy, to hit that 2.4% target, we would need to be spending an additional 41%, which is £22 billion in today's money, between 2015 and 2027 on research and development. That is a very, very sizable increase, and below that, Richard puts it in perspective. Between 2004 and 2015, spending increased by about £6 billion. So not all of that money will be going, is coming from public funding. The idea will be that the amount of public investment will go up through UKRI, and at the same time, more investment will come from the private sector. But they are now hard at work trying to put a serious roadmap behind this 2.4% target. And we're going to see from UKRI in mid-May, I think 17th of May is the envisaged date, the publication of a strategy which will be their first attempt to map how they intend to get towards this and the sort of direction of travel under the new structures. So, it's big news. Other things have been announced in recent days. We saw in the week of UKRI's formal launch, first week of April, they announced this new fellowship scheme, the Future Leaders Fellowships, which almost instantly, the moment they were announced, became the sort of gold standard UK early career fellowship to apply for. Up to 7 years of funding, 550 fellowships across all disciplines. A really significant scheme and a very welcome attempt to support research at that level in that cohort of the system. Cynics might look at this and say, well, it's a neat fallback if we end up falling out of the European Research Council, which is true. This would, to some degree, occupy similar territory to an ERC scheme. But as we'll come to in a minute, if we hope that we end up with both continued participation in EU schemes and this, it's a significant new investment. The other thing I'll mention, I won't go through in details, is on top of the changes at the top and the cast list I've mentioned of new leaders of UKRI, we've also seen a pretty much wholesale change in the leadership of the individual bodies within UKRI. So pretty much all of the chief execs of the research councils have rotated, been replaced in recent months, and also on the 1st of April, all of the old councils, the council boards that existed were, ceased to exist, and new councils came into being, new committees. They are effectively, they're no longer separate bodies. So taken in total, there's been a massive influx of new people within the new system. The big questions then that persist are how will the different layers of governance interact in these new structures? How much genuine autonomy will the executive chair and the council of the ESRC or the BBSRC have relative to the new strategic layer that's been created? How far and fast will the strategic centre, the sort of mega brain of UKRI, grow? How will the really thorny questions of balance and prioritisation across funding work through the system? And we don't really have answers to those questions yet. We have sort of glimpses as more stuff comes out. There'll be more in the strategy that comes in May, as I mentioned. But these are the really big questions. And the legislation gave us part of the answer, but really it's only once this stuff starts operating in practice that this will become clear. And so into all of this mix of sort of opportunity, new money, new structures, lots of hype and rhetoric, comes then, of course, the complications of Brexit in terms of the changes that that will bring to the research system. And those changes, of course, are multiple and profound in a number of ways. The biggest issue remains, of course, issues around mobility and freedom of movement and what Brexit will mean both for non-UK EU researchers who are currently living and working in the UK and others who might have come or might come in the future. But putting the mobility questions to one side and focusing on the funding structures, here the words from the UK government have been generally warm. There was a statement of intent published in the autumn of last year, this collaboration on science innovation paper, as a contribution to the Article 50 negotiations. That doesn't go into a lot of detail, but says that basically we'd like, if we can, to stay in EU funding programmes, which, remember, bring something of the order now of 850 million pounds a year into the UK research system. So the sort of warm words are there, but there's not much detail. The best report, the best document I think that's come out to look in detail at how this could work and the kind of options that the UK will have in negotiating the detail of this once we get to that stage of the Brexit negotiations. The best document is this report that came out just a couple of months ago from the Wellcome Trust, which sets out quite a detailed and useful map for how we would continue to be involved, makes the case for the UK basically paying to play, putting more money in to be part of these schemes. That's an idea which I think enjoys widespread support across the research community, but more mixed political support, and is of course bound up with all of the bigger political questions attached to Brexit, particularly around freedom of movement. So we don't really know, is the short answer, and no surprise, it's the same for nearly everything under Brexit. But this was a piece in the FT just a few days ago. UK science can still take nothing for granted, and I think that's probably where we stand. There was a sense just before Easter that the now Science Universities Minister, Sam Gyimah, was slightly pulling back from the level of positive commitment that was implied in the document the government published back in the autumn. So it's really quite unclear. Most of our EU partners would like us to stay in EU funding schemes. The UK research community would like to stay in. I think probably we'll find some way to be part of those schemes, but there might well be a hiatus, a gap of some years while the details worked out. I think it's far from clear that we're going to segue neatly into Framework Programme 9 from where we are now. In many respects, of course, the UK system is well set up to take advantage of other international collaborative opportunities, quite aside and separate from the consequences of Brexit. So the creation of the Global Challenges Fund, which is, of course, oriented towards developing countries, the Newton Fund, which was set up around the same time, focused on a target list of emerging economies, and various other sort of international schemes, the Rutherford Fund and others. All of that taken together has actually increased considerably the volume and range of collaborative funding streams that can support UK research in partnership with other countries. This is outside of Europe. So there are options, if we do end up in that situation. It's not a sort of unremittingly bleak picture. But I think if we're being realistic, none of the options on offer is anything like as attractive as the current system that we enjoy through the EU framework schemes, and it's hard to see how it would become so in any rapid order. Just this week, today in fact, they've been discussing research. Of course, the CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, is taking place in London this week. That's a picture from Monday of the chief scientific advisors or their equivalents from around 22 Commonwealth nations, with Prince Andrew for some reason there in the front, talking about Commonwealth science collaboration. And of course, all of this now takes on a strong post-Brexit inflection. But I think in research, as in other areas, those who see the Commonwealth certainly as a sort of answer to this are optimistic at best. There's this quite spiky and interesting book that's just come out this week by Philip Murphy, the head of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, basically trying to debunk the sort of Brexiteer hope that the Commonwealth will ride to the rescue. And some of you may have seen the piece that was in The Guardian a few days ago, extracted from that book, Sorry Brexiteers, Banking on the Commonwealth as a Joke. That's a bigger argument than just science, of course, but I think it applies with some force to this debate. So, to end, 5 priorities for UKRI and 5 for us. I've given the context. I should say, for me, as someone who studies research policy, research systems, I've always been, sort of structurally ambivalent about UKRI. I've never felt strongly that bringing everything under one roof was the answer, nor that the system as we had it was necessarily working brilliantly. So I've tried and sort of followed this stuff quite closely as it's gone through, tried to sort of remain relatively balanced in looking both for the positive opportunities here as well as poking occasionally at some of the inconsistencies or aspects that Mark Wolpert and others perhaps don't like to talk about. But to say what I think some of the priorities are, firstly, and this will be a really important part of the strategy that they bring out in May, UKRI needs to show us as a community how it's going to undertake smart, open prioritisation through the research system. This is the big promise. Grand challenges, if we're talking about how they play through into research funding, are really about priorities. It's about putting more money into certain things at the expense of less money elsewhere. How one does that in the research system is intensely political with a small p. It's very difficult. If any of you have read, as I'm sure some of you have, David Willett's recent book on the university system, he talks in there about this issue in the chapter on research and says basically, I looked at it, I saw how complicated it would be, I saw the kind of politics at stake, and I walked straight away. I left it well alone. The opposite is now happening through UKRI, at least in the promise of what this will bring. It is supposed to look afresh at balance and prioritisation across the system. The idea of balance in the funding system is enshrined in the legislation, although one person's balance is another person's lopsidedness, I guess. But I think in the context particularly of this new target for more money being spent on R&D over the next 10 years, UKRI needs to lead a properly evidence-informed, open debate about priorities and balance by discipline. So that, of course, relates to how much money goes to each of the individual research councils or the other component parts of UKRI. By region, bringing in all of the issues around the imbalance in the UK economy. Between discovery-led and directed research and challenge-oriented research, whether it's through GCRF or Industrial Strategy Fund, is, of course, directed, but there are sometimes responsive elements within it. And between grant-based and quality-related QR funding that we get through the REF. To look properly at all of that in the round, think afresh about how it sits then, of course, for us as universities, in a bigger debate about the sustainability of university funding, all the other debates that are linked to the Auger Review on fees, is really important. It's a very, very difficult job. And I am intrigued to see how UKRI go about it. The one area where they have been doing it quite well, I think, is this consultation they've been running on research infrastructure, which they launched a few months ago, which has been quite open. They've invited a lot of evidence and it seems to be proceeding quite well. But in many respects, that's easy compared to some of these other questions. How much money do you spend on the councils? How much goes to Innovate? How much goes to QR? What do you do about the Golden Triangle? So a second really important thing in the context of industrial strategy and the government's wider aspirations is to tackle the role of place in the funding system. And this is something that hasn't really had any serious emphasis in public policy and research policy, certainly since the 1960s. The table at the bottom there is too small to see. I mean, what it shows, unsurprisingly, since the mid-1990s, is a further slow but steady increase in the concentration of research funding in the Golden Triangle, so Oxford, Cambridge, and the big London research intensives, which will be no surprise, if you're sitting here in Keele or if you're sitting in Sheffield, where I do, because we live through it and see it year by year. UKRI is, of course, a funder for all four nations. It's a funder for all the regions. The governance structures of UKRI aren't terribly promising, at least at the offset. The main board of UKRI has only one member who is not based in London, Ian Diamond. And, we need to really see how, whether it's through some of the 4.7 billion for the industrial strategy or other mechanisms, how place gets a serious degree of emphasis in the funding system. If you're really serious about place, and if you take into account what's happened in research concentration geographically in this country since, certainly since the 1980s, really you'd make a decision, the kind I'm suggesting here, that priority should be given in terms of all new facilities, all large strategic investments to areas outside the southeast of England for at least 10 years. And I mean, that would only begin to start to rebalance the research economy, leave aside the wider economy beyond research. So this is, as you can start, I mean, you can imagine the consequences of these kind of moves. Otherwise, if you don't do something, on that scale, you're just tinkering at the edges. UKRI then also needs to invest in a next generation of research leaders. I've mentioned the Future Leader Fellowships, which I very much welcome as a great scheme pushing in that direction. But there's also a need to think about the models of research leadership, the career pathways of research leaders inside universities. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And within UKRI itself, as a research funding agency, how is it going to bring talented people to work for it to help run this system intelligently? Mark Walpert and John Kingman are very taken by the so-called rotator model as it works in the National Science Foundation in the US, bringing academics in for 2 or 3 years to work in the funding system, and then they go back out to their university jobs. We'll probably see more of that kind of thing. You're already seeing it with some of these challenge leadership roles that have been recruited or are being still advertised at the moment. But it's still, early days, and it's not necessarily that attractive to leave beautiful surroundings like this to go and work by Swindon Station for 2 or 3 years. So there may be some issues to deal with there. I also think in terms of the funding modes that UKRI operates, it needs to show through its scale and size that it could be more creative in the kinds of funding mechanisms that it uses. And there's a lot of interesting debate and actually quite a growing body of evidence to support lottery-based funding schemes for certain schemes. If you get things beyond a certain basic quality threshold, then basically put them into a lottery and dish the money out that way as a far better way, a less wasteful way of allocating responsive mode type money, given the low success rates that we now see in large parts of the system. So these are the kinds of things that we don't see much of at the moment, but we could see more of. Something that I am personally very passionate about, but I think would bring benefits more widely, is for UKRI to invest in the research information infrastructure and to support more evidence in this area. So basically investing in research on research, so-called meta-research, better understanding how this system operates. We spend an infinitesimally small amount, given the scale of investment in research in this country, 6 billion now, 8 billion soon in terms of public money, on actually properly researching and evidencing how well that money's been spent, how different ways of funding could work better or worse. So I think there's real scope for a sort of What Works Centre type initiative in this area. As a very modest contribution to that, I'm involved in this project with Research England we announced last week to do a real-time review of the new REF, looking at the new rules of the REF and how they're being experienced through this system much more widely, so going beyond just institutional views. But there's lots that could be done. And finally, we need to renew commitment to public engagement and responsible innovation, particularly in a post-Brexit context. UKRI so far has said very little about public engagement, and it feels institutionally as if a lot of the memory of the kind of GM Crops era, where the research councils were forced to take public engagement very seriously, has been lost in the system, even though we know, of course, and reinforced this week by the report on AI from the House of Lords, we know, of course, that we're going to have all of those same debates we are having at the moment, all of those same debates around AI and machine learning, digital technologies, and many other emerging technologies. So I'm going over time, I'm just going very fast. Opportunities for us as researchers as opposed to Ukraine. Number one, obviously, become fluent in the Sustainable Development Goals. They are the lingua franca of global challenges research out with UKRI, and they are the basis on which the Global Challenges Research Fund is now operating. So they're very, very important. We need to be really serious about team science, a concept that has had most currency in the biomedical sciences, but which has potentially much wider application. Very interesting new book came out a couple of months ago by Barry Bozeman, his colleague, on the new science of team science. UKRI's structures, the way the funding system is going, demand more and better modes of team science. And to enable that, we need more of the bridging, the brokering, the intermediary skills in the research system, as well as researchers who are excellent in their own defined area. We need also to invest in new structures, capacity for collaboration, knowledge exchange. Your own Vice-Chancellor, of course, Trevor McMillan, very much at the heart of this debate, and the KEF, as a new F to add to the list, will measure capacity and effectiveness in various ways for that. But, with respect to engagement with business through the Industrial Strategy Fund and other mechanisms, there's a lot going on, and there'll be a lot more resource available than has been the case in the past. In terms of interaction with policy, we're also seeing a lot of universities setting up novel policy structures, think tank type entities at the boundaries between the university and public policy that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. A few examples on this slide. In terms of how we think about research careers and the kind of mix of skills and capabilities within the system, we need to broaden those criteria and start rewarding, promoting hiring on the basis of different criteria as well as those that we're familiar with. And this table here of leadership qualities comes from a document the ESRC produced a few months ago. Very interesting to see their sort of emerging thinking about the new types of leadership in research. So, disciplinary leadership is more familiar to us, interdisciplinary leadership, complex project leadership, leadership in impact generation, leadership in public engagement. These are the kinds of things. And the metric tide review that David mentioned at the start that I led a couple of years ago looked in some detail at some of these questions around what measures we use, what we value in the system. It's a really important debate. Finally, and then I'll stop, I think it's really important that as many as possible of us get involved in UCRI, whatever we think about its origins and the way it's going. It needs to be, if it's to be effective, if it's to live up to its promise, a body that draws on distributed collective intelligence through the system. Another nice book came out a few months ago, Jeff Mulgan, my former sort of mentor boss at Demos, on this model of collective intelligence. UKRI is a classic example of an organisation that needs to be fueled by collective intelligence. A huge amount of what we know about how the research system works is out there in universities like this, in businesses, in other research bodies, and there's no way in which a small group of people at the centre are going to be able to tap into all of that without properly creative efforts to open up, pluralise, broaden the range of inputs. And it's really important, particularly if we are going to be spending all this extra money, that we have this debate openly. I've ended there with this point on the biomedical bubble. I'm about to publish in a couple of weeks' time, or 2-3 weeks' time, around the time of the UCRI strategy, a new piece I've written with Richard Jones, looking at the existence of a biomedical bubble in UK research. If we want to ask the really tough questions about UK research funding and how it's been spent over recent decades, we of course need to draw attention to the regional imbalances. We also need to draw attention to the disciplinary imbalances in the system, and the fact that the biomedical part of the system was always well funded, but has continued to grow faster than any other part. And the data is quite stunning when you look at it. That investment was originally predicated, or at least in part predicated, on the pull through into the pharmaceutical industry, which remains an important R&D sector for the UK economy, but of course is nothing like as effective in its own R&D productivity as it was a few years ago, and indeed is going in a sort of spiral downwards. So these are very big political, economic and organisational questions for the system. I welcome the UCRI moment as a chance for us to have that debate, and I hope we can all contribute to it. Thank you.